Great. Thank you all. I truly appreciate it. And what a wonderful way to kick off with four just outstanding scholars sharing their perspectives. Really, really grateful for all of you, Ute, Melissa, Tom, and Jeff. Now we will move on to the next generation of great scholars that I'm not going to say they're going to supersede the generation we just talked about, but we'll see. Time will tell. But we are thrilled to have this next group of scholars with us. And this includes Trevor Israelsen, Kylie Heales, Andrea Sottini, John Dwyer, and Ashley Roccapiore. So thank you all for joining us, and really excited to jump into the conversation. So Trevor, maybe I'll start first with you, and looking back on some of the research that you're doing. But how do you find or cultivate diegesis in a fragmented media ethnic societies? And what, if any, role does faith play in helping entrepreneurs find these narratives or meta narratives and shared myths, and particularly as they look to shareholders? So would love to hear some about your work there.
Thank you, Brett. So you used the term diegesis, which is something that we talked about in a recent paper. And basically, this connects back to what Jeff was talking about as entrepreneurship as meaning making. And this term is about, when you're trying to tell a story about the future, how do you really make meaning? And the argument is that you have a story, a fictional world that you're creating about the future. But that's only believable if you can connect it to the other fictional worlds that other people have talked about and created through stories. And so there's this interweaving and embeddedness in stories. And the reason that's really, really important for questions of both faith and entrepreneurship is that, stories constitute culture over time and across generations. And a tradition is something that is handed down and transmitted, and it acquires greater meaning as it is passed down. And there's been a lot of research on the role of tradition in religion. And, the people who've studied literary canon, or people who've studied meaning making across generations, they inevitably go back to religion and to religious ideas. And I think that's because they're really, really deep stories, and they capture in a way what is most glorious in terms of the ideals that people have. I think every religion has something about self-sacrifice, for example, or something about unselfish love. And they're ideas and concepts that are really the spark of divinity in humanity, right? They're things that make us better than, they're the stories that are bigger than the realities that we observe. And so I think it's also very, very important to recognize that when you study the history of religion, it's defined as much by acts of human flourishing as it is by extreme acts of violence, right? And so it's really important to hold both of those ideas together at the same time. And one way that we've tried to do this in our work is to say, well, we can see religion as practice, and it's really, really important to see religion as a practice, but we also can study stories, and these deep stories that contain what is glorious or fearsome about humanity. And what's interesting is when you start to look at deep stories, they're bigger than any tradition, any specific religious tradition. So that the details of what self-sacrifice means, or the details of what unselfish love means, are unique to a particular religious tradition. But they also become inscribed in things that are different from from any particular religion. And so if you look at popular culture and you watch, I don't know, Marvel movies or something like this, there's these tropes, right? They get carried down and they resonate from a religious tradition, but they're carried forward and secularized. And Weber talks about this, right? This iron cage of meaning that's passed down and transmitted across generations. And so what's the role then for the entrepreneur in all of this? The entrepreneur, I think, has to be able to be very, very pragmatic. You have to channel the, and here I'm not talking instrumentally about how to convince people, but really how do you convince yourself as an entrepreneur that what you're doing is worth doing? And then through that, and then you also are making meaning with the various stakeholders you're interacting with, right? But you have to be able to understand the glorious ideals that come from the deep stories that you're building in and extending. But then you also have to be very, very pragmatic and say, here's this gap, this huge gap between the ideals and the reality. And here's how we're going to bridge this gap. And to me, this starts to tap into some of the questions that we were just talking about dark side of religion, because if the entrepreneur is operating only at the level of the stories, only at the level of the glorious ideals, there's a very, very real chance that the entrepreneur is going to start to manipulate those stories. But if what we encourage entrepreneurs, our students to do is actually, okay, you need to mind the gap, right, between the ideals and the reality. This is what Philip Selznick talked about, right? There's co-optation, there's potential for weaponizing ideals and values. And so for me, in my work, it's just really, really important to hold the stories and the ideals at the same time in your mind, and figure out how to help entrepreneurs to both create better stories, but then also to be able to have some degree of integrity, resisting co-optation of values. And I think that's really important in the world we live in right now, because it's not just the history of religion that has violence, but even today, religion is weaponized to oppress people. So that's, I think I said all I wanted to say. So I'll turn it back to you, Brett.
Thanks, Trevor. Appreciate it. I want to switch over to Kylie Heales. And Kylie, you're doing some emerging work on the concept of grace, and grace as being a central concept to entrepreneurs and organizations. So could you talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like, and as well then maybe how you can actually theorize from sort of indigenous faith conceptions?
Yes, thanks, Brett. It's great to be here with everyone today. And as a shout out to, just before I start, the PhD seminar that's coming up at AOM, actually everyone on the panel today, we met and came together for the first time at the 2022 PhD seminar. So now to see 3 years later, everyone's work and where we're getting to is just, it's such a privilege and a joy. So thanks for having me on this panel.
Just to be clear, we didn't make her say that. She said that voluntarily. Just
Good call, Brett. Yeah. Very cool experience. So actually this idea of grace and working on it as a concept that influences the way that entrepreneurs go about the entrepreneurial journey came as a seed in that seminar as well. And so grace is, for a definition to bring you into the conversation, it's an unconditional and voluntary gift in the presence of unmet expectations. And it's got this definition from a theological construct of a Christian faith, in where the grace of God is this extension of the covering of sins of individuals so that then they can go into heaven. So that's this concept of where it comes from theologically, but we actually see it in everyday life too. And this is why it's so fascinating. And the more I spoke to people about the concept of grace and pitched this idea of, what is this organizing power of grace that appears in our world, the more stories I collected of where it appears. And so unbeknownst to me, grace actually appears in computer games as well. So when you enter a level in a computer game, you've got this time period where you can't die, you can't be killed. And so you've got this period of time where your limitations are overlooked. And so whilst you would expect to die under certain circumstances in that setting, you're given this period of grace. It happens in patent laws when you fail to file your your inventions for patent protection before you publicize them. There's still this grace period that you're allowed after the fact. And so this manifestation of grace in everyday life and having theological foundations in its definition and manifestation is very interesting to me. And I think that's what gives us license or scope to bring conversations that are theologically founded into management and entrepreneurial literature. And so what I am seeing in some of the data that I'm analyzing of podcasts where entrepreneurs talk about their entrepreneurial journey is where they reference grace to either make sense of things retroactively, in this case based on the data set, but also to explain real life situations that were taking place. And so there's three different ways I'm seeing that grace is contributing some sort of generalizable theoretical construct that we can then advance our knowledge of entrepreneurship. And so one of those is about institutional pausing, institutional suspension. So if you think about a situation where an entrepreneur fails to meet investor climates and or expectations, and they need this space where a certain retribution or justice would typically be given, and instead grace plays a role. And entrepreneurs talk about this space where what would expect to manifest gets put on hold. And this institutional suspension of norms creates a space for something else to take place. And so rather than this taken for granted patterns that we have of how these relationships should unfold, instead something different happens, but the whole structure isn't broken down in that process. So I think that's a really interesting role of grace. Other things like gifting, under its very definition, grace we see as being this voluntary gift in its definition. And then this gifting that happens amongst entrepreneurs where they are talking about dealing with employees, and typically some sort of outcome would have to happen. And instead they decide to gift grace to the employee to help them work through a process rather than terminate them, for example. So that's another way this gifting, rather than an economic transactional process plays into it, we see gifting appear in grace as well. And then relational work is another space within the grace concept where instead of having a power dynamic in which one person is above the other, does grace, this is a question I'm still trying to wrestle through it, and I would love any engagement that people have and interest in this feedback as it continues to develop, is that in partnerships with churches, for example, entrepreneurs share that in receiving grace from some of their partners when they fail to meet expectations in that setting, it transforms the relationship. And instead of having some sort of power dynamic in which one person was serving another, it levels the playing field. So what does that mean for power distribution and theories of power when grace is at play? I don't know. Still working on that. But this is the stuff we're starting to see. As you can see, I'm really in the data as well, in that getting it out of making those connections to theory. Just to quickly wrap up on the concept of how to, as a self-identifying Christian believer, work on grace as this construct when it's indigenous to me. So something I found really helpful is having a thought partner of a different faith. We have a shared a shared theoretical home of organizational theory. And so we're able to talk about it, the construct of it, the concept of it in the organizational theory realm, and have a shared dialogue on it, but they're actually Hindu. And so the concept of grace is very foreign to their way of thinking. And so what does that mean from a religious perspective? Check back in terms of where is my insider knowledge coming in? Where can I actually validate claims? So that has been very helpful. Also getting, of course, friendly reviews from those who are not in the space, and rather wanting to make sure any contribution that we make is theoretically driven, has been very helpful as well. So these are the standard types of advice that I think we're always, as young scholars, encouraged to do. So I don't think it's any different, but making sure we're deliberate in those practices has, at least in my development of these pieces, been very generative.
No, that's great. Thanks, Kylie. I appreciate not only the concept of grace, but also the process that you're working through as you try and work within theological concepts, because there are insider outsider issues that come to play, and we don't want to have any blind spots to that work. So thanks for sharing that. Next, I'll transition to Andrea Sottini. Andrea, you are doing work in African contexts and seeking to specifically to understand poverty. And religion plays a key role here, and it often does, and yet it's relatively neglected by some of the literature in and around this space. So could you tell us a little bit about how does religion shape sort of like the meaning of poverty in your research as it relates to necessity entrepreneurs?
Yes, thank you everybody. Thank you, Brett, for inviting and organizing this very interesting conference. Thank you also for granting me this opportunity to talk and present. Yes, these ideas, this study that we're doing in Sierra Leone and in some other few countries. And yes, we started thinking about religion as Africa has been mentioned before, Ghana studies. Ethiopia too, because religion is very key in this context. So even if you try to tackle other research question, they often go back to this important factor. And indeed, religion rise in this context fundamental questions, also about determinism. So what you actually can do or what you can't do, and free will. What actually you have the agency to cover and to control the actions you do and the outcome you do, you take over. So and when we put this framework into the context of poverty, so how much you can actually take enact against poverty, or how much poverty is granted by others, by God in certain sense, or by the destiny, or by the fate, we discovered. But as you go on the field, you can see clearly that they experience big tensions between these factors, because on one side, we may say also in the literature that religion constrain because of fatalism and considering a fate as determined in your life. Then if you burn poor, then you believe to remain poor. But on the other side, also fate is a very big engine for fueling energy to act and to take over and to control your life. And these two do not necessarily are from two different sides of the coin. They sometimes are part of, they coexist in a certain sense. They're not far from each other. They can coexist. They can cooperate somehow, even if looks strange. But so when we talk about religion and meaning of religion in poverty, what you can see is that it is a very complex situation with many meanings that coexist, of within even the same person, of powering over religion, or powering over power of poverty, or being undermined by poverty. But what is interesting is that so the meaning of poverty really shapes not just accordingly to the opportunity you have, material opportunity you have, the opportunity around you, so having contact with the institutional intermediaries that can take over, or your life, or resources access, but it's really, and first and foremost, up to the belief you have on how much you can act against it. And what is also interesting, and in this context is interesting, is that some entrepreneurs that we talk with were moving beyond poverty, even in a resource lack of resources context, just because they believed that they were not alone. They were with somebody, and who grant them the power. And so here is even, you see, there is a bit of fatalism, but there is a bit also of agency. So in this context, you find this mix of these elements that really deeply share the meaning of poverty, because shape the meaning of who you are and with whom you are in this journey. And so basically the chance that you have in your hands, regardless, if you want to say, of the resources, necessarily the material resources that you have surrounding. So that's are my two points in this conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, and also for the work. Doing field experiments in Sierra Leone is no small task, and really important work. So thanks for the work that you're doing. Next, I'll move on to Sean Dwyer. Sean, you do a lot of research on purpose, and so could you talk a little bit about how does having purpose, and specifically maybe a faith-based purpose, shape entrepreneurial decision making, especially when the ventures aren't typically viewed as like social, where you sort of see like, oh yeah, of course, those are going to go hand in hand. What does that look like, and what have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, I just want to say thank you. It's such an honor to be here. So many scholars here I look up to. So it's, yeah, such a joy to be speaking with you all today. And shout out to the PhD seminar. Grateful for that as well. But happy to answer this. So yes, my research looks at the pursuit of venture goals aimed at positively contributing to others. Kind of call this purpose, this intention. We can call it like a purpose-driven aspiration more generally. But I think we all know in the entrepreneurship literature, there can be this dichotomy calling some certain types of firms commercial firms, so like more profit oriented, seeking economic value creation, social ventures, maybe more focused on solving societal problems, social value creation. What I think is super interesting from what I'm seeing in my research is when individuals have a really strong religious identity salience, they're highly religious. This distinction can get really blurry. So my research, I'm really interested in these commercial ventures that are, your typical for-profit, maybe everyday business ventures, really looking at them. But what's interesting is we know from empirical research that highly religious entrepreneurs have a proclivity towards creating value for others and focusing on others. There's research by Brett and Jeff and Michael Conger and Mitch Newbert and JBVI in 2019 that said, the primary outcomes of entrepreneurial action when folks are really driven by religious calling, religious identity salience, things such as helping others financially, serving others through the venture, sharing religious faith with others, honoring God. Like we're saying, effectively what this paper is saying is, these are going to be the outcomes of religious entrepreneurship. And in a sense, these are really all pro-social in some respects. So, you take that, you bring it into your kind of your everyday, your for-profit business, maybe a necessity-based venture. We're seeing these pro-social behaviors. So I just find it to be really interesting. So in these contexts, when these purposes are really shaped by religion or faith, just because the venture itself, maybe the business model can be a little bit more economic in nature, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see an absence of the pursuit of, spiritual goals and things like this. And what I'm seeing, so I traveled to sub-Saharan Africa about 2 years ago, and what was interesting was it was mostly all necessity-based entrepreneurs. And what I found was that profit was essential, not just for them to be able to survive and feed their families and things like this, but for certain forms of spiritual value creation. Profit actually, creating a profitable business built trust in the community. It gave them a reputation so that they could then use that as a platform to have influence in their community, to share their religious faith with others and things like this. So for these kinds of entrepreneurs, these necessity-based for-profit entrepreneurs, I was really seeing the word like platform stand out. So they really see their businesses as platforms to accomplish these faith-driven goals. And I kind of look at it as like profit serves kind of as the legs, if we want to call it that, of this platform. And without that profit, really this platform can collapse in terms of maybe the faith-driven goals that they're seeking to accomplish. I think there was really one really interesting case, and from some of my qualitative research, I was talking to an entrepreneur who runs a small vegetable stand, very subsistence based, very simple business. I think most of us would, perhaps call this is a necessity-based entrepreneur operating a for-profit commercial venture just to survive. But what was interesting is that he called his business a kingdom business. He said this vegetable stand is a kingdom business. And the reason for that was because he connected his business to a part of, we can say, God's greater plan for his life. These are the kind of words he was using. So this sense of purpose, the desire that he wanted to, the goals that he was seeking to accomplish through his venture, of course, it was for the money, but it was like like what was mentioned previously, what was that money being used for? What was the purpose of this venture? And he really saw his venture as making a kingdom impact, he said. So this just like really stood out to me in the way that religion can reframe work as part of something even greater. And just published a paper recently in JSBM on the influence of religious faith on persistence and the psychological effects of this. And what we found in that paper was that when the sense of purpose is driven by religious faith, that this can have an impact on persistence and entrepreneurship. And just think it's really interesting. And was actually just giving a talk the other day to some leaders in economic development. And what we're talking about is what does it look like to reframe work in such a way that where instead of an individual seeing as I have to do this work, but instead seeing as, wow, this is actually part of maybe God's greater plan or a higher power's greater plan or something like this. And I believe that's going to imbue this sense of purpose, which we know from the psychology literature is going to have incredible effects psychologically, mental health and well-being, physiologically, and stuff like this. So I think it's really important. So long story short, I'll just kind of zoom back out again. I just think it's really important for us as scholars to look beyond the venture characteristics. Maybe it's, oh, wow, this is just a vegetable stand, or this is a really highly economic venture. Let's look beyond that and really look at the characteristics of the individual, the entrepreneur, maybe the whole entrepreneur, I think as maybe Jeff mentioned earlier. And I just think there's plenty of room in the literature to examine spiritual forms of value creation. I know in one of Brett's papers talks about spiritual return on investment, and just an encouragement to not just look at these larger companies, larger ventures, but also look at these micro ventures, perhaps necessity-based entrepreneurs making a positive impact, at least from their perspective, seeing their small businesses making an incredible spiritual impact. So I think the implications are profound from a mental wealth and well-being perspective when religion is imbued into a venture and they're able to pursue these purposes or these higher order goals as a result of running a for-profit business. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, Sean, thank you. Thank you for sharing your work and thoughts in this area. I'll transition to Ashley Roccapiore. Ashley, your recent scholarship and research centers around attraction, hype attracting early employees, images attracting engagement, these sorts of things. How might studying various kinds of attraction in faith and entrepreneurship lead us to a further understanding of the field and what's going on?
Yeah, so I'll also start like everyone else on this panel as a thank you for being here. I actually attended the first L.I.F.E conference, and then like everyone else said, was at the PhD seminar. So it's kind of cool to be full circle moment at the 5th L.I.F E conference and be a panelist. But when I first saw this question that Brett had sent out, the word that really caught my eye was attraction, especially because I would never or haven't yet defined myself as someone who looks at attraction. But so I actually looked up how is it defined? And what's really interesting is when we look at like just general definitions, it's basically the attraction of or the power of evoking interest or pleasure or liking. But those who know me know that my husband's a physicist, so I think the physics definition actually works better for what we study, which is a force under the influence of which objects tend to move towards each other. And I think that that's really important, not just for faith and entrepreneurship, but entrepreneurship generally, because I think that a lot of our research in entrepreneurship is typically one-sided, of either looking at an entrepreneur's perspective of things or a stakeholder's perspective of an entrepreneur. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice by only looking at one side of the equation. And I think that when you look at our Brett, Jessica Jones, Christina Heimer, and my special issue SBE that Brett mentioned at the beginning, one of the things we actually found was when you look at these different types of investors and you look at investors who don't have any sort of faith aspect built into their investment group, it actually is worse for entrepreneurs to talk about their faith. And then if you present as an entrepreneur to people who have similar faith backgrounds as you, the only time that it's actually beneficial to you is if they view you as authentic. And so I think that by looking at both sides of this attraction paradigm, we'll call it, I guess, we have a better understanding of how does faith as an entrepreneur influence the stakeholders' perception based on their own faith. Is this something that attracts these people together, or is it something that's going to make them butt heads? And I think in practice, we see this a lot, like with a lot of my qualitative work with investors, we see that especially angel investors who want to have some sort of social interactions with entrepreneurs after they wind up investing, they want to do this with people that they get along with, they can mentor. And so if those individuals are ones that don't align faith-wise, this might be a way, a reason why they might not choose to invest with that individual. So it kind of goes back to what our leading scholar panel was talking about of this idea of figuring out what the outcome is that you're wanting to pursue and then aligning with that. And I think too, I actually was reading in popular press, there's a in the Catholic Church a guy that's known as the millennial saint. He's actually going to be canonized as a saint at the end of this month. He actually was born in 1991. He died at 15 years old. But what's really interesting is for him is one of the things he did, and they never actually talk about this as being entrepreneurial, but it was something that really kind of flagged to me as I was reading all of these news articles, was he was creating websites. And first it started as like a pastor at the church asked him to create one, but then he started creating all of these websites to basically catalog all of these miracles that were happening for the Catholic Church. And I think that part of this desire to do this was highly driven by his faith to act entrepreneurially. But I also think that because of that and what he did, and he did it in a way that was relatable to other people that are millennial age, he's actually gotten a lot more press and a lot more people pushing for him to be a saint because of this. So I think that there is this cool dynamic too with even within certain faith traditions of how do these individuals act entrepreneurially, even if it's not an entrepreneurial venture per se. Their behavior and their actions are attracting attention, are attracting even the entrepreneur to a particular avenue to pursue. So I think that there is this interesting dynamic there too, that we just assume that entrepreneurs are ones that already have started business, but we have this whole literature on corporate entrepreneurship and these nascent entrepreneurs who are pursuing entrepreneurship but haven't officially launched, that are acting entrepreneurially, and they could be doing that because of their faith or even through their faith, like this millennial saint Acutis did. So I think that there's interesting dynamics there that haven't really been explored yet, that I think open up avenues to look at this dynamic of how do entrepreneurs attract stakeholders or resources or things around them. That's all I've got.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. As we look across the presentations and the different scholars in their work, there's work on the presentation of various telos, shared narratives, purpose-driven firms, grace, attraction. But as we start to think more broadly about faith and entrepreneurship and taking this seriously and centering on different models of desirable futures, like what does that look like? How do you get, or how do you see this work being taken seriously and centering as we move forward towards sort of desirable futures? And I'll sort of open that up to anyone who wants to talk about that.
So I can jump in just briefly, and that is that I don't want to say the same thing that I said in my comments, but I do think that it's really, really important to pay attention to the difference between the fictional future and the reality, and to study both of those things empirically. So study articulations of the future, but not believe the discourse too much, but also to be able to say, here's the reality, and if the reality may not be as glorious as the fiction or the values, but that's not to say that we're going to stick with just the depressing reality, right? How are we going to make the depressing reality more like the glorious ideals that come from faith.
I can step in and share something. So something that I've seen in a lot of my qualitative research, even when I'm not asking about faith inherently, when I'm talking about future-oriented goals and things like this, it's not a paper I'm working on, anything like this. Remember, I think I talked with Amanda Lawson about this, but this idea of eternal rewards is something that I think super fascinating. Different religions per se, but the concept of I'm doing this now in my business, I'm treating these people this way now because I expect an eternal reward. So it might look illogical why people are acting these certain ways, or maybe acting with grace. Maybe it's because they're not expecting some sort of return now. Maybe it's nothing from an investor, it's nothing from a customer, it's no one here now, but it's actually in light of, when I die, I will get this eternal reward. And I think that idea of this future, I think is something that's super fascinating, where people's motivations are coming from, why they're engaging in activities that might seem, yeah, somewhat illogical. But if we go deeper and we figure out why they're doing this, we can see that it's anchored in deep religious beliefs. So I think that's something that's interesting to consider for the future as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Sean, to hear you talk about this time linked to behavior as well, building off what Trevor said. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the role of time in your work on in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So we've got this very real lower mortality rate that individual entrepreneurs deal with and make decisions upon for their families, for their businesses, for their with the idea that maybe they're in a country where they'll only live 60 years. And yet they have this faith component that actually says there's this eternal, infinite value of time. So what do you think would play into changing that? Because there's a lot of conversation in international development work around if we can get people to think longer term beyond a real short-term mortality rate, but to them eternity is real. So it's not this fiction future, it's actually a reality for them. I guess it's Trevor as well. I'm curious.
I'll share very briefly. I mean, I think what's super interesting from what I've seen there is, we might classify some of these individuals as necessity-based entrepreneurs, but they're spending a significant amount of time. I can think of one entrepreneur, she closes down her shop. She could keep it open, but to go serve in the slums. And she serves as a pastor there in the slums, makes no money from them. She said normal pastors won't go to that place because there's no tithes and offerings. So she's shutting down her business. We could call her a necessity-based entrepreneur to go and do this. And it's like, that does not make sense per se. So this notion of time, like thinking I'm doing this now to help these people, but it's also very, very future oriented. I do think in some respect, what comes up in my mind is almost everyone was talking about school fees. We need to pay, we're trying to think of the next generation. How can we invest in the next generation so we keep our family going? So I think there may be some intricacies there that I might pass off to someone else, but those are kind of the things that stand out to me, is this willingness to sacrifice now, even in circumstances where it seems like you shouldn't be sacrificing because of this higher goal, this longer term objective. So I'll pass it off to someone else if they have further thoughts. It's a great question, Kylie.
Yeah, just on your point about fiction versus reality, I totally agree. And I think that there's always an element of fiction in an entrepreneurial vision. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, say, faith is fictional for the entrepreneurs.
Great. At the risk of asking another question, I'm not going to, because we're at 10:35 and never do you end not one but two panels on time. This must be like divine intervention. So thank you to all of our panelists, to Trevor, to Kylie, to Andrea, to Sean and Ashley, for sharing your time and your thoughts with us. We have gone through the first two panels. We are now going to take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 10:50 a.m. Eastern time. So get up, walk around, and we will see you in just a little bit. Thanks again for everyone on this panel. Appreciate it.